Hello, travelers, and welcome back to another episode of the Architect's Forge. In this episode, we'll be looking at the Mace Escorts, the elite infantry that come in the Beyond of the Song of the Dormant for the forces of Feudom. As always, we begin by looking at some lore on this unit. The Mace Escorts are the elite guard of the Semputurnus, the head of the church of the moon goddesses. Its members have vowed not to shed the blood of their enemies with the edge of a sword, so they fight in a way that the feudal knights describe as dirty. That is, beating people with maces. The escorts use imposing ceremonial maces that neutralize enemies and make them an easy victim, in turn increasing their own defensive abilities. The Mace Escorts are in charge of carrying out secret operations and are emblazoned with the Hand of Glory. The Hand of Glory represents one of the most precious objects of the Semputurnus, the stuffed hand of an elf that reminds them every day that one of their main missions in Lindworm is to cleanse the world of that accursed species. So, not necessarily what many would consider the good guys, especially if you are a Seanan elf or a Scion elf, or even one of the elves that works for Embersig. But with that, we'll move into the Mace Escorts profile on the battlefield. But before we do that, I'd just like to remind you that if you're enjoying this content, please like, follow, and subscribe to the channel. Helps me know you're watching, and if you have any comments, if you have different thoughts than I do on this unit or any of the other units I've discussed, please put it in the comments. I always like to hear what your thoughts are. If there's any specific synergies I should think about with this unit, it's always very helpful for me and anyone else reading the comments. If you did want to try and support the channel financially, it's not necessary, but there is a link to a Buy Me a Coffee in the description below. As well, if you're purchasing anything from the Corvus Belli store directly, there is an affiliate link also in the description below that if you use it when buying from the Corvus Belli store, I get a little bit of a kickback from them on it. So with that, we'll move into the Mace Escorts on the tabletop. So we begin looking at their basic stats. The Mace Escorts come in at 35 points, which is a relatively high cost, but is to be expected for elite infantry of their nature. They do bring a command token, which is very nice in Feudom, as Feudom does have a number of very strong command token abilities, including one on the Mace Escorts card itself that we'll talk about later. They come in at a 3-2 move with a charge of 9, which is on the slower end of speed, both for movement and for the charge. So, a bit to be expected of guys in heavy plate mail, but, be aware of that they're not the fastest guys out there. In terms of wounds, they have 3 wounds, which is on the higher end of infantry, but is in keeping with these two model units. But still, it does mean it will take a bit more to take out a single one of these guys. And they have 2 orange dice for willpower, which is quite good. They're very unlikely to flee, and making that even more unlikely, they have a very high morale of 3 as well. 3 morale, I can't think off the top of my head of any other units that aren't characters that have 3 morale. It is pretty much as high as you can get. These guys are not very likely to flee, or it means that you have a lot of room to stress them for, bonuses or to have them not move, for example, if they lose a combat. So 3 morale, very good. As would be expected of an elite unit like this, they do only have availability 1, but I expect you'll probably see that 1 being used quite often. Moving into some tags, they are human and infantry, for what it matters for characters that are attaching and require human infantry. I believe to date, and I expect it to continue, all Feudom infantry are human infantry. Feudom is not, as we saw in the lore section, the most accepting of other species, so expect everyone to be human, but it's important for tags that require the human infantry or infantry. More importantly, they have the knight keyword. This is actually very relevant and increasingly relevant as we see more and more characters released that interact with units either specifically having the knight keyword or not. Things like the Magister that we spoke about in the first impressions of that model, where if a knight unit does something that the Magister allows a non-knight to essentially do the same action. So having knights is important, so having this keyword is very nice. They have a pretty standard conquest for a unit of this nature. They have 1 conquest, but importantly, it doesn't degrade when they do, so there'll always be that 1 conquest, plus any attached characters you might have in them that increase it. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, they are a unit size of only 2, which means that while they are 3 wounds, their actual total wounds for the unit is only 6, which is lower than the standard 8 of a 2 wound 4 model unit. When looking at the basic stats, we'll move on to the attack. Before I do, from the basic stats, we're seeing a relatively, morale resistant unit. Nothing particularly special. No special keywords, no abilities up there. But otherwise, a pretty standard but high morale unit. Moving on to their attack breakdown, looking first at their non-degraded form, we see that they come in with a red, an orange, a yellow, and an automatic hit, which averages about 3 hits with a maximum of 5. This is pretty good damage with a pretty high maximum. It's not the greatest in the world, but it's still pretty solid. And having an automatic success in there does make it more consistent because it's 1 less die roll that you're relying on. In terms of specials, they average about 2 1/4, which makes the switches pretty easy to get, or at least one of them, which we'll talk about a bit more later. When they degrade, they drop the red die and it becomes an orange die, which does bring their average down to only 2 hits with a maximum of 4, which isn't great, but it's not, it's a degraded profile. We expect to see them drop. At least you have that guaranteed hit still in there. So that's at least something. We see, though, because the orange has more specials on it, the average specials actually goes up, which makes it even more consistent for the switches. Now, I haven't really mentioned it. The Mace Escorts do have the ability to stress to add a blue die to their attack, outside of helping potentially to defend themselves from units that do damage when defending. The main value of the blue die is to, give you a 50-50 chance of getting another special. And as I was saying with the blocks, it's about a 50% chance to get a block out of the blue die. So I don't think you're going to necessarily be stressing often for that blue die on them when they're attacking, but at least you have that option. Moving into switches. In both the offense and in both the non-degraded and degraded form, they have the same 2 switches. The first is a 2 switches. 2 specials will allow you to add a hit to your roll if your target is already disarmed, and 1 special will give them the disarm state. The single special trigger, the giving the disarm, is pretty reliable. Whether a full strength or degraded. Now, on average, you don't necessarily get the double special switch. On average, you do get the 2, but not enough to add the disarm yourself and then do it. Essentially, if you want to be getting it off, you usually want to really have disarmed on the enemy already. Now, this becomes more likely when you're being supported by another unit, for example, Guisarm that can give disarmed in attack and defense, or potentially if the Mace Escorts themselves have already been attacked, because as we'll see, they can also give disarmed in defense. But you're relatively unlikely to get both switches to trigger in the same attack, so you really want that disarmed there first. Now, moving on to defense, we'll see that they have a green, a blue, a black, and a automatic shield in defense, which averages about 2.63 blocks with a maximum of 5, Once again, this is a pretty solid defense, and the auto shield helps with consistency. You're averaging about 1.63 specials, again, helping with the switches that we'll talk about in a minute. I do like that this unit has, in offense, it has one of each die. In defense, it has one of each die. It's kind of, I like the symmetry. When the Mace Escorts degrade, they lose the blue die and drop to just a green, a black, and a shield, which does drop their average defense to about 2.13, which is still pretty decent for a degraded profile. And your specials average also drops to 1.13. Now, as is the case in offense, and I think more valuable in defense, you can stress in both instances to add a blue die to your roll. This adds another 50-50 chance of getting both, getting a shield or a 50-50 chance of getting a special. There are some die faces where you get both, which can be quite valuable. I do think you're more likely to see Mace Escorts stressing to add a blue die in defense to really just try and tank a hit than you are when they're attacking. And as we were saying with switches, in defense, you have pretty much the same switches, the almost mirrored form from the offense. So you still have that single special to give the disarmed. And now the double special is if your target is disarmed, you get to add a shield to your roll. As we saw, getting a single special is pretty reliable no matter what. So if their opponent is not disarmed, you're pretty likely to be able to apply it. On average, you won't be getting the double special switch, though. Even if you do already have somebody disarmed, you're not really guaranteed. You're averaging not getting the two, but the idea of getting three is pretty hard, and I wouldn't rely on it. So really, it requires that you get disarmed onto the opponent first. Now, this is more likely when you've already attacked. So let's say the Mace Escorts charge in and attack an enemy. They're pretty likely, as we discussed before, to get the disarmed on the opponent. So now when that enemy attacks them back, they're disarmed, and they can use that double special to add an additional block. Now, it's important to recognize that you'll apply the disarm to strip one of their dice, but even when you do that, the disarm does stay on the unit until the end of the activation. So even though you have used it to strip a die, it will still be on the enemy unit when you are activating your switches, so you can, so it does actually work. Likewise, as we said before, if you're being supported, Mace Escorts, as we'll talk about, often are supporting and being supported by other units, as is the Feudom way. If you're supported by a unit like Guisarms, who are also putting out disarmed, it makes it much more likely that your opponent will be disarmed, and that therefore you do have that option to use the double special switch to add a shield if you can get the two specials. So the ability to add defense and offense in the offensive version, and also a very powerful state like disarmed, are actually pretty good switches. So I'd say the Mace Escorts, it's hard to get both off in one go, but depending on the situation, either you're adding disarmed, which is just a great ability thing to add to opponents, or you're getting your offense or defense increased. So these switches are quite good. Nothing particularly flashy, but just, dependable, reliable switches, which is kind of the theme of the Mace Escorts. They're just this dependable, not too spicy at this stage at least, units that can just, do the work. Now, I say they're not too exciting, but really that comes in their abilities, where they do get quite interesting and exciting. And the first of these is called Loyalty and Sacrifice. It's a command token ability that allows you to, once per round, at the end of an activation of an enemy unit, if they are within 11 strides, you can use this ability. So essentially, if an enemy ends their activation within 11 strides of the Mace Escorts, you can spend a command token to use this ability. And what the ability does is it allows them to charge the enemy unit, and this charge does not count as an activation, so you won't suffer stress. You won't, add an activated token to the Mace Escort. So what is, what's the value of this? Well, first of all, is very good area denial. Opponents don't want to take free charges because part of the charge is both the move and the attack. So it does deter enemies from moving and ending their turn or their activation within 11 strides of a Mace Escort. This can be very punishing with good positioning because if you position your Mace Escorts correctly, it can deter opponents from charging other units that you want them to charge. You're less inclined to have them charge because of fear of this double tap, this Mace Escorts joining in. So, for, giving an example, if a unit charges, say, Guisarmier, who are close enough for the Mace Escorts to use Loyalty and Sacrifice, and the Guisarmier are able to pass their willpower check to not be pushed back after they lose the combat, well, now the Mace Escorts will get to charge into the opponent, who's probably disarmed because Guisarms are very good at putting out disarmed even in defense. Now they're charged in. Now you're getting the gang up bonus. Your opponent is losing a die or a defensive symbol, and you're getting to punch them likely disarmed, so you're getting that potential of an extra hit. So it's not something opponents want to deal with, so it can really deter people from moving into a position. It also helps protect objectives from being taken. For example, let's say Mace Escorts attack a unit you have on an objective and push them off, claiming it for themselves. If they end that activation within 11 strides of the Mace Escorts and the Escorts charge in, now the Mace Escorts might just push the opponent right back off the objective, or if they have an attached character boosting their conquest, just out-conquest them, and now rather than take the objective like your opponent planned, you just have swapped your units on them, whatever was there before, for your Mace Escorts. Their second ability is a passive ability called Escort, and this targets allied characters within 5 strides of them. What it does is the target may add a block to their defense rolls, and additionally, the Mace Escorts may suffer any amount of damage that the targeted character was about to take. So what this does, it really helps keep normally vulnerable characters that are running around solo safe. A lot of the time, solo characters can be easily picked off if they're targeted, and there's only so much you can do to protect them. This allows, a relatively tanky unit to both take some of the damage and also just giving them an auto block. Now, it is important to keep in mind that because this ability doesn't say it doesn't require line of sight, it means it does require line of sight. So you want to make sure that the escorts can see the character. One thing you need to watch out for is enemies wrapping the character when they charge in and blocking line of sight. So I'm just going to go through a quick graphic to kind of explain what I mean by that. And here we go. So this is what I call the bad bodyguarding. So, we see the Mace Escorts watching Verena, very powerful solo caster that blasts away at opponents, and we see a unit of intact. Now, we see the green line just is my way of showing the Mace Escorts can see Verena, but we see there's a bit of distance between them. They aren't right up against each other. We'll say that's within 5 strides. Now, the intact declare charge into Verena. Their leader moves in. And then the next step is for the intact to, do their piling in movement so that they're engaged with Verena. Now, they're able to assume a position similar to what I have here. Now, because the intact have wrapped around and because you cannot draw a line of sight between 2 models in a unit, so for example, those two the bottom and bottom, left intact, you can't draw a line through there. So now the Mace Escorts no longer have line of sight to Verena, and Verena will just have to take all the damage that she will suffer from the intacts attacking, and she won't get that bonus defensive dice. Now, if you're trying to avoid that and you really want them to be protecting her, you can do something like what I have on the screen here. You see now the Mace Escorts are essentially touching Verena. So now when the intact charge in, the leader goes in and the other intact surround her. But now, the intact aren't able to position in a way where they can cut off the Mace Escorts, cut off their line of sight to Verena because, they're right touching her. So this means Verena will be able to benefit from the Mace Escorts guard, escort ability, and get that extra protection and pass wounds off to the Mace Escorts themselves. So it's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't even necessarily need to be the Mace Escorts themselves, as long as you can have a way to block opponents from blocking your line of sight. But just be careful with larger units that are able to do this surrounding and wrapping individual characters, that you prevent it in a way that you're not going to lose line of sight. So that's the main profile, and just going over some quick, summarizing analysis of the unit. The way I see them, they're a bit of a jack of all trades. They're fairly defensive, fairly offensive. They aren't, topping out either category, but they're good at both. Really, their power comes from their abilities. First, through the ability to charge in when an enemy ends within 11 strides of them. This is a very powerful area denial ability that also helps you maintain control of the points. And as we always say, you win not by killing, but by scoring points. There's also they also have the strong escort ability that helps you protect otherwise vulnerable solo characters. And Feudom has a number of characters that like doing things on their own, namely casters like Verena or Morgane when she leaves a unit to cast her very powerful spell that gives disarmed and vulnerable, which we'll be talking about in a video relatively soon. But with that has been my look at the Mace Escorts. I think they are a very good unit that you will probably see in a lot of Feudom armies. As a Feudom player, you really want to get good at positioning them to help protect objectives and zone out where enemies want to end out and protect your solo characters. And as a another player playing against them, you want to keep in mind that charge radius, that you don't want to end inside, and know that when you are ending inside, you need to be prepared for them to charge and try and push you back. And in terms of their escort, try and remember what I said. If your opponent doesn't position the escorts well, and you can bubble wrap the character to get around the escort ability, it's definitely worth a shot. But do keep in mind that even if you kill that character, there's a good chance those Mace Escorts are going to charge right back in. So always be prepared for these mace-wielding guys to just slam into you. So with that has been the Architect's Forge. I hope you enjoyed it, and may the dice be ever in your favor.